Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore, Explain. My name's Andy Kirk and it's a great pleasure today to be joined by RJ Andrews. RJ, how are you doing? Good to see you.
Hello from San Francisco. We're doing great.
Good stuff, mate. Just to kind of introduce yourselves, can you give people a bit of a background about who you are, what you do, and where people might find you?
My name's RJ. I make maps, charts, and diagrams. I sometimes introduce myself as a data storyteller. I make stories with data, and then increasingly, I'm also making stories about data.
Oh, meta. Great stuff. So today we're going to look at one of your pieces that you worked on last year, a passion project of yours, published July 2019, which we'll come on to because that's a critical point of this project. Neil and Buzz Go for a Walk. So for the benefit, especially of the listeners who can't see this work right now, just can you give a quick overview about what this piece is? What's in there? What people would see when they visit it?
Sure. So Neil and Buzz Go for a Walk is what we call scrollytelling, which means it's a story that progresses as you scroll down a web page. And they're basically, the web page is cut into two pieces. There's like sort of a top 2/3 and a bottom third. The bottom third is an isometric view of the moon's surface with the lunar module, the LEMS, right on the moon's surface near the center of that isometric view. And as you scroll through the piece, you see Neil and Buzz move around the lunar surface, doing all their science experiments and other activities that they did on their moonwalk. Okay, so that's the bottom third. The top 2/3 is a transcript of their actual exchanges. Not all of them, but the ones that I've selected to help tell the story. And the transcript is actually presented as a dialogue between them as if it were text messages. So as you go through, you see Neil and Buzz talking to each other left to right. And as they're talking to each other, you can actually see how that corresponds to their activity on the illustrated lunar surface on the bottom of the screen.
Fantastic. And we'll come on to the different dimensions and layers of content that you sort of so astutely fused together for this. Just sort of tracing this all the way back to the origin. Now, I mentioned in the intro there, it's a passion project, self-initiated. And I think what characterizes a lot of your work is this sense of, for want of a better term, vastness. So you do a lot of work on sort of landscape and parks and on history and now space. You don't take on these easy small projects. But this was something that I really was struck by almost the last part of the page, which is your background motivation for doing this. Can you just speak to that motivation, the thing that you wanted to know about that you didn't know about, but also how this then works as a passion project that you can then sort of share as a portfolio piece?
Yes. So there's a lot of ingredients. All these pieces take a lot more effort than you expect, every single one of them. And so turning the corner to actually committing to, I'm going to put this piece in production is always a big deal. And you have to have that passion, that curiosity, and I'll mention specifically what that was for this piece, but there's often other ingredients as well. And so this piece actually didn't originate as a passion piece. I was directed by a publicist I had contracted to pitch Apollo anniversary story ideas. And so this piece was conceived originally as a static print media piece. Right. And nobody wanted it. And that sort of has its own drama, which isn't really relevant, I think, to our discussion, but maybe we can talk about that some other time. nobody wanted it, but by the time I was done with the static piece print, I'd really fallen in love with the concept, and I saw a couple things in it that this would actually make a better interactive than a static print piece. Okay, so that's the real origins, and I haven't talked about that, anywhere else. Like even in the design essay, I sort of just present it as like, oh, I wanted to do this. No, the real story is like is often more messy, and like the real story is like nobody else wanted this, but I still believed in it. So it's like, one of the things you can do as a freelancer is like, well, gosh damn it, I'm going to go and do this, right? And so that's kind of like one ingredient. The other ingredient is like there was this anniversary, and what I've learned is building pieces for anniversaries is like not a good idea. And the reason is because you think it's like a tool to help focus the creator. It's like, oh, there's a deadline and here's a theme for me to work to. But honestly, like it's not, anniversaries are not a thing that help focus the audience at all. Like your piece is not going to get any more attention because it's the anniversary of the thing. And if anything, it's just going to make your piece not particularly evergreen, because the anniversary is going to blow by, and it's like, well, who is the piece still worth it or not? So typically, I don't like doing stuff for historic milestones. But that was like particularly because at the publicist's urges, that was an ingredient here. The other general thing is I like space. One of my first jobs was working for NASA at the Kennedy Space Center. I worked on the space shuttle, and so like a lot of people of our generation, like we sort of have this like pretty positive kind of affection for the Apollo era discovery. Okay, so personal curiosity. Oh, and then the other thing is like craft. So there's two elements of craft when I think about these passion projects, which is this of course became. And so as soon as it turned into an interactive, it's like, I'm doing this for me. And so one of the, when I attempt one of these big passion projects for Info We Trust, I usually try to do something technically challenging. Let's use a new tool, learn a new library. And part of that is because I want to sort of be entertained, build my skill set, but also like build out the portfolio to show people like I can do this. And so technically I never made a storytelling piece before. And so I was like, I really wanted to make like a real meaty storytelling piece. And okay, so that's like one ingredient. But the other side is like, I'm also very intimate with the history of the craft of information graphics, and understand sort of what we've accomplished, what we've lost, and always want to kind of be pushing things forward. And so Alberto Cairo's PhD thesis is all about the loss of illustration in information graphics, and sort of looks forward to a day when we can combine a lot of our technology with illustration. And so this piece is very intentionally hand illustrated and tries to make illustration interactive in hopes of showing people that this is something that can be done and something that we should be doing more of. And so there's this idea of developing my own skill set, but also trying to do something that's a little bit unique and different for the broader craft itself. All right, so that's all sort of background, but the big question is like, what's the particular like personal curiosity? Like what actually drove this piece? And the question that drove the piece is that I understood the Apollo 11 mission pretty well. I've watched all the documentaries. Like I worked at NASA. Like all my friends were like space nerds, and like there's all these great explainers on kind of like here's how the rocket launch works, and here's how many days it took to get there and back, and here is sort of this. They had this very sort of like all these errors on their landing, and Neil had to take over the controls and do like this famous manual landing where like they almost ran out of fuel and almost had to abort. And so there's like sort of all this drama, but it's like I didn't actually know what they did on the moon. Like I didn't know how long were they there, like how much area did they explore, like, what did they do? Like all of these like basic human questions on like, what exactly did they do on the moon? Like I had this idea of, okay, they saluted the flag and they collected some moon rocks. And I think they talked to the president and like, I had this like cartoon, like a couple famous snapshot, you know, and I understood like everything about the mission, like almost better than I actually understood like what the mission was really all about, which is like put a man on the moon, right? At least that's the first half. Put a man on the moon and, you know, return him safely. So okay, so the piece is very focused to just answer that question. And when you're talking about that question, you're talking about, you know, the everlong challenge in our craft, which is showing space and time together. And so that's kind of like the general challenge that this piece is trying to answer is how do you show space and time together? And it's very specifically bookended that the first moment of the piece is the hatch opens, the last moment of the piece is the hatch closes. So it's everything that happened on the moon surface, and I just ignore absolutely everything else, because honestly, everything else has already been addressed, you know, rather completely, and like there's no need to consider that.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating, and I think you are right about that sort of multi-track intent, motivation, goal that you are working towards, and you know part of it is the curiosity, but another part of it is flexing your muscles, trying out new things, refining the craft. You know, some of the passion projects I work on are as much about me doing a project to then write about it and to learn about it. But I'm kind of fascinated as well about, you talked about the idea of milestones, anniversaries, and I get that idea that there is something problematic about it because it forces you into a deadline. I mean, it's a non-negotiable deadline in some respects. There's also though something about there's loads of other people doing something, and it's a kind of cluttered market, and so for you to be able to sort of surgically find this, don't know something about this topic that's been so well covered, is actually a hard thing to find. So it must be, at least on that level, quite satisfying to home in on that angle of analysis.
I do believe it's a particularly unique view, or at least a unique vision. Yeah.
Now, going back to the discussion about print, and maybe we'll touch on this further. Obviously, the medium through which you've developed this is very much digital. It's something that's a scrollable experience that you spoke to. Just in terms of the tensions between sort of mobile and desktop, did you foresee this as, let's say, primarily a desktop piece, and we'll find a trade-off for the mobile version? Because actually, trying it out on mobile, I found it an extremely rich version. It wasn't obviously a compromised version, but did you, when you realised it wasn't going to be a print piece necessarily, did you feel that you anchored towards one of those two?
So I generally sort of don't care much for mobile. It's sort of like if you bring a tiny screen, expect a tiny experience.
Yeah.
That said, like, look, this piece is coring on a text message metaphor. So like it's like you're going to be able to read the exchanges really well. And then there is this flourish in the piece where, which is sort of mobile driven, where not only are you scrolling through text exchanges, which is the radio transmissions, you know, the astronauts talking to each other and back to Houston, but there's also media. And so what the media is again, the bottom third of the piece is this illustrated view of the moon. And so as you're scrolling through, what I'm doing is I'm doing blow up views of the artwork as if the astronauts are sending images back and forth to one another. And so that's very intentionally that if you're on mobile, you'll still see the moon, and you'll see the astronauts moving around it, and it works fine, but it's obviously not going to be as big as on desktop. And so putting those images in the stream gives people sort of a zoomed in view, like in a way that's very natural to mobile. And so, and then what that afforded was this opportunity to then have fun with those images, because every one of those images, you can hover on it or on mobile tap on it. And what you'll see is the original NASA media that inspired it. So you'll see either NASA video or NASA photographs, and you can kind of see the real thing. And there's this sort of like, I don't know, backbone of authenticity behind the media.
Yeah, I love that notion of almost the metaphor of the kind of text message transcript, or the WhatsApp kind of bouncing between each other. I think that's again another reason why it works so well on mobile. So next up, you've talked about that you were kind of pitching this originally, but primarily you worked on the actual task alone. Did you seek out any other people to collaborate with, to work on? Obviously, you were trying to develop some new kind of practice opportunities, but did you have any other people at all involved, even in a check-in thing, a kind of critical friend sense?
Yeah. So there's sort of a stack of critics. The most useful critic is anybody who's not yourself, because they can just tell you what you can't see. But at the other end of that critic spectrum is somebody who can not only identify what's broken, but also tell you how to fix it. And I'm very lucky here in San Francisco that there is a community of freelance data storytellers and frankly just creatives who can kind of lend a hand. And so there's a muralist named Alice Lee, and her work is really, really beautiful. And I was at a design studio which is shared by Alice Lee and also Shirley Wu and Catherine Madden, two data viz people. And I was just like, hey, Alice, will you take a look at this? And she looked at my artwork and she's like, it's not working. And it's not working for this reason, and you need to change it this way. And so what wasn't working is originally all the astronauts were line artwork, meaning that I illustrated them with outlines, and they were all sort of white fill, and it was blue and red outlines for Buzz and Neil. And she's like, the problem is when you look at this on a phone, they're going to be too small. So line work doesn't work. And me, as sort of like a fumbling artist, like didn't know that intuitively. And then once she said that, she's like, oh, okay. And then the other thing is, remember, this was conceived for print. And so it has a paper white, background on it. And she's like, yeah, when you do that, the most salient object is the moon's surface. And like, that's not what the story is about. The story is about the moonwalk, the astronauts walking around. She's like, you need a black background, like duh, obviously, like we're out in space. And she's like, that will make the lunar surface have less contrast, and then you need to do filled artwork, not line artwork for your astronauts. And so then it's like, okay, well the background's an easy switch, but now I have to learn how to do filled artwork. And so then I went and learned how to do filled artwork and re-illustrated the whole piece.
Right, not an insignificant task to go through, I guess. But I suppose another extension of the people that you can run this past, even if they by default have more of a lens as a kind of professional in the field, are they also potentially representing your audience for whom this may be intended? Because obviously, on one level, it's for you, it's for the kind of interests that you have. And I guess for the most part, you are a decent representation of the kind of people who would come to this and spend time with it. But do the people that you run this past, Shirley, Catherine, Alice, do they also try and represent a proxy audience?
I will also show it to friends who are not practitioners beforehand. Particularly my wife. I mean, my wife in many dimensions is my secret weapon. But one of it is that she has a great eye. And so she's not a practitioner, that like she doesn't do this work at all, but she can tell me, she can definitely tell me when it's not working, and she does it often. And she can tell me what she likes, and she's just, it's so useful to have her to help diagnose. And then other family members and very close friends who, again, have sort of been cheering on Info We Trust, for the last, 7, 8 years. And so it's, those are relationships that you've massaged and curated and invested in, and you're very lucky to have those people. And in some sense, you're designing for yourself. You want to make something that delights you, but you also want to make something that delights them. And if it's hard to think of like what is the median person, like what's going to work for them. If I don't know, like that's not particularly motivating. And I don't know how useful it would be, because I don't really know what, like, I'm in a bubble, right? I live in a bubble in San Francisco, like, and I'm trying to do something different and something that's kind of like on the edge. Like, I'm not trying to build something that's, it's a fool's errand to try to build something that's going to go viral on Facebook.
Right.
Right. Like if that happens, like, okay, fine. And I've been lucky to have that kind of success in the past, but like, I've never arrived at that kind of success designing for it.
Yes. Yeah, it happens as a consequence, but yeah, you don't ever choose to make something viral by any deliberate choice, I guess. One of the things that I really liked about the description that you attach, and it's not just for this work, it's to many other of your works, is the idea of a data adventure. And that does come across in the experience. And if we talk about the classic, I mean, this is the reason for the podcast name, Explore, Explain. If we think about the classic exploratory piece, those would be experiences where you've got a few more dials and widgets to manipulate, modify, but this is more about interacting to journey through the experience, and it does have that literal sense. What is it about that term, data adventure, that sort of draws you to use it, to distinct it from other pieces?
I think that... And
sorry, just to interrupt, is it as much about your adventure as much as the experience of the product?
So, I mean, Info We Trust is, sort of founded like late at night, because we stumbled onto a funny, a funny pun. And one of my friends had commissioned a piece, and I was like, well, if I'm going to make this for you, then I may as well publish it under my own banner as well. And so since then, it's been this really this sandbox that I've had to play with and to adventure, and to not only like adventures into data, but adventures with data. And this piece, I think, really does that, because it's not obviously data driven. And that's characteristic, I think, of some of my best work, is that you don't really understand how many different data sets are going into make this possible.
Yeah.
And how much like behind the scenes work is happening. And sometimes you kind of reveal the curtain on it in sly ways, and sometimes you just don't. I had this short film about the national parks called Profiling the Parks, and the at the very end I showed what the elevation data actually looked like that was driving the whole piece. And, so sometimes you pull the curtain back a little bit. But this one, is relying on, geographic data and photo archives and transcripts, where there's, dozens of columns, in spreadsheets in order to manipulate those transcripts. And, I sort of point to it a little bit because I have this, below the lunar surface illustration, there is a sort of very abstract chart timeline that's tracking kind of what's happening. So you get the sense, and there's a lot of back and forth, like, should I keep that in or should I just kill it? Because it's not essential to the piece. But I the aesthetics of it, I really liked actually the aesthetics. I thought it gave it a really nice kind of sort of just baseline to the whole piece. And so and that aspect of the piece does not work, I don't think, particularly well on mobile. But I liked it. Like that was a choice. Was like, I don't think, like, this is more for me than for my audience, and so like that's why that stayed in.
Yeah, no, and just on the note of the data, so yeah, this, even from the outset, you can tell that this isn't just a conventional run a download, export spreadsheet, everything on a plate. And looking at the detail that you do provide with the projects. Transcript text, you've got the moonwalk video, you've got the maps, you've got the image library. This is a rich multimedia project that you've had to sort of to forage for, to bring in, to then sort of synthesize. Just going back to the origins of those data sets, I mean, how did you get from the curiosity that you're pursuing to knowing that those are the data sets that you need and where to find them and even how to obtain them? I mean, is it just literally roll your sleeves up, do some Googling, get on the phone to contacts? How do you get that journey completed?
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about working on a piece about an event that is attracting so much attention and just, is so iconic is that there's already been a lot of groundwork laid for it. And so USGS and NASA have both put out just a huge volume of, copyright free, right, available data sources. And so the one we start with is the transcript. That's the backbone. You read the transcript, you figure out what do you want to keep in, what do you want to throw out, what parts of the transcript tell the story. And then there's a triangulation that happens where you have all kinds of different resources, including photos of the lunar surface where you can see the trails where they actually walked. And then you can see abstract maps of the lunar surface. And then you combine that with photographs that people have already done the research to like time-stamped it. And there's this triangulation that happens like, okay, this photo was taken from here. So they were about here at this point, because what you're trying to figure out is like, where were they at each minute of the transcript?
Yeah.
And so like that's, and you're not only doing that, like where were they? Like they weren't always together. And so I had this, one of my planning, there's a lot of planning documents. One of the planning documents was this like giant Adobe Illustrator, like multi-layered thing where I'm tracing time by time the actual path that they're walking. And you have to do that, and you have to construct the whole journey, because then you're going to pick out which slices of the journey you're going to show in the story.
Right. Now, I did envisage you having like some private investigator's wall with all these like photographs and stitching and different.
Yeah.
Because as you said, one of the great challenges in any visualization is when you encounter space and time, and how you kind of show that in parallel. So I did wonder about the kind of devices you had behind the scenes to plot that out. I mean, is it fair to say that, although I'm sure the build itself was a great deal of work, that the big chunk of your time was on gathering, preparing, cleaning, synthesizing these different data sets?
Yeah. So yeah, the data work was, I think like the most straightforward thing was manipulating the transcript. And so that's sort of straightforward. But then the really creative thing is blending the data. And again, blending the because it has to be done by a human. Like a machine can't do it, because you have to look at the photos and look at what angle you actually have to look at the photos and try to figure out like, okay, this was from here, this was from there. And there are maps that have been created that kind of show where the photos were taken from. And so you do have resources, but you're trying to smash together all those photographs and the transcript. And it was a manual sort of like step-by-step kind of effort. So that's one leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool is actually developing the artwork. And the third leg is like making it work on the web, which is, all like interactive design.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do think there's something there that we sometimes neglect, just how much work goes into gathering things like illustrations, even making them, imagery, videos, and all this other non-standard categorical quantitative data. But this does enrich the piece, and I think one of the characteristics of this work that you've put together, it feels very much like a National Geographic piece. And knowing what the folks who work there go through, and these very, very kind of long-term projects when they kind of build models and then making video animations, and it's a real you can see from the final piece itself just how much work has gone into it. But when you hear about the craft that you brought into this, I think it enriches it even further. But just last point about data, is there anything that you wish you could have had, but did not get access to, that you would have otherwise introduced?
Not that I can remember, although that, it's possible that at the time I wanted more data than I had.
Everything.
Yeah, there is a point about revisiting the piece, which I don't know, maybe we'll come to that eventually, but that's not a data question.
Yeah. Moving the discussion on to the contents that we see in the work itself, and you've talked that there's essentially three things at play. There's a transcript conversation. There is a isometric, I think that's the correct term, sort of 3D kind of angle projection of the situation, the scene. And then we've got this sort of, I don't know what we're going to call it, a bubble chart timeline, this sort of almost this sort of a solar system sort of dangling off the bottom.
Yep.
So there's three components there. Now for the transcript, I can't really think of any other way that you could have shown that, but did you explore other ways of piecing together the interactions, the conversation in any other way?
Let me think. So it wasn't always. Yeah. So I guess it began as an interview transcript, right? And so originally I was thinking that this would be a quickie that I could publish on Medium with like static images of the moon, kind of like in full widescreen, and that you would just like kind of go through like a digital essay, and maybe we could color the text, for each astronaut as they talk back and forth. But originally it started off as like looking like an interview transcript, and only once I sort of committed to making this actually an interactive did it start to get kind of playful. And going back into my let me think. So in my references, I actually have a screenshot from Shirley Wu and I having a conversation on Twitter about this piece and how to plus it. And the reason I have a screenshot of that is because I like referenced the Twitter direct message kind of UI, not my phone's text message when I made this.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I can't think of any other ways of handling the text content. I think it works perfectly as it does. And then, of course, we've got the other, as you said, the kind of interplay with the map view. And with respect to the map view, did you ever consider or try out, let's say, a shot from above?
So a shot from above doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because then the astronauts become dots.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of this piece is to try to convey the human experience that they had. And so you needed the isometric, like you couldn't do it at an elevation view because then you have no sense of space. You need an isometric view because you need to show how tall they are, and you need to show like the relative distance that they're moving around the moon across a time period which is about the length of a film, right? It's an hour 43 minutes. And so, but the question is like, what isometric view? And so I built I assembled a 3D model of the lunar surface using Google Earth, which also incorporates Google Earth has a moon kind of module, which is kind of clunky to get to. But what you can do is you can add layers. And so what I was able to do is take my planning docs, and I knew all the scenes that I needed to hit in my story. I could put all of those onto the Google Moon, and I represented each astronaut by a rectangular prism on the moon at the correct height. And then what I could do is I would fly around the moon looking for, because I knew I wanted one static angle. I didn't want to like shift the camera at all, and then choose the right composition that would give the sense of height of the astronauts, but also not obscure any of the important story points with the lem. Right. So none of the action of the astronauts in my story happens behind the lem. It's always in camera. Right. And maybe a more talented artist could figure out how to do that. But like, I'm an engineer, like my approach is, just to blow it out. And so I'm going to build a 3D model, and I'm going to look at every possible angle, and I'm going to pick the absolute, best one. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've never really thought about that, but yeah, you can imagine getting quite deep into it and thinking, oh crap, I forgot about that moment when all the key things are happening in the shadows there. Yeah, but I mean, what I loved about the description you applied to this sort of theatrical stage, I think that's a perfect description, because it does feel like a play acting out.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the transcript, you got the conversation, but then you've got this, this literal sort of rectangular stage, as it were, and these guys are moving around, and I think that's a brilliant way to describe it. But also, I guess beneficially from that choice is that you don't take up a great deal of real estate on the page,
Mm-hmm.
to allow you room, therefore, to have not just the transcript given a fair chunk of the space,
Mm-hmm.
but also then this third element, which is this. In a sense, it feels like it's a highly representative progress bar, because it helps you to orientate.
Yes.
And I do think, even though you said you didn't think it worked that well on mobile, I actually think it works just as well on mobile, because it does give you a sense of where you are.
Yes. Yeah.
More so than just some kind of clunky browser where's the progress scroll bar. So I think that works terrifically well. And also the fact that it doubles up, therefore, as an encoding. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the size of the bubbles is it the duration of that particular passage?
It's actually the number of characters.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, which is correlated to duration.
Yeah.
So this design, I mean, once we decided to do it, it was actually like quite a lot of iteration to arrive to where we landed. And so the idea is that you have, for every 2 minutes of the story, there is a stack of bubbles that hang down. And so they're, it's like a sort of like a negative stack of bubbles, and each bubble represents a unique exchange by somebody in the transcript, and the bubble is sized by the number of characters in that transcript, which okay, now they're colored, and the color corresponds to the actors in the story, but quite a lot of the bubbles are just grayed out. And they're grayed out because this is not a transcript reader. This is a story. It's edited for excitement. And so quite a lot of the exchanges are just left out of this story. But I really wanted to show you that. I wanted a way to make it clear that I wasn't showing you everything. And so graying them out was very, very very, very important to me, as somebody with trust in their brand, to always sort of convey exactly what I'm showing in the data, what I'm not.
Did you therefore contemplate encoding that within the transcript body part? So having, I don't know, some notion of empty space, or a kind of negative space where, yes, there's something here, but move along. We're going to skip that.
I mean, you could put like ellipsis or something like that. The way that's sort of treated in the transcript is that there's timestamps between the different scenes. And so like you have, and there are some ellipsis in it, but it's like those timestamps and ellipses are more at the service of reading the story. They're not at the service of disclaiming what's not there, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You talked about the fact that this piece was very much bound by the hatch opens, and then I can't actually remember what the end point is. I guess the hatch closing, but
yep.
Were there any bits that you felt you needed to lead up just before or just after, or was it very much a clear-cut start point, end point throughout?
So I think that there was a version of this conceptually early on where it started with you scrolling, and as you scroll, you landed the lem.
Right.
And it actually flew in. The problem with that is that they didn't land and then go for a walk. Like they landed and took hours. I forget exactly. It was like, I don't know, 6.5 hours, maybe longer. Like they spent a while preparing. And like what happens is you start bleeding into like, this is not what the story's about. The story's not about them like getting dressed, right? And so like, but I mean, you could have, and in the same way, like the story could finish with the lunar module like taking off, right? But then it's like they didn't leave when the hatch closed. Like, what did they do? Like, they ate dinner and they tried to sleep for 8 hours. Like, that's what actually happened. And it's like, okay, so now it's a like, and there's like sort of this moment where they have to lose weight and they throw out a lot of their equipment, and it's just like scattered on the lunar surface. And like it's like the fringes of the story, like the reality is like quite messy. And so you have to start negotiating that. And then it's like, well, like there are already interactive explainers of the entire lunar mission. Like that's specifically not what I wanted to do.
Mm. No, that's interesting. I mean, just as a side note, I'm just trying to imagine the prospect of trying to sleep when you're on the moon. I mean, I just don't see how that happens. But anyway,
yeah, they figured it out, I think, by maybe Apollo 15. It took several missions. Basically, Buzz slept like an hour and a half or something. Neil didn't sleep at all. And the reason is like they had like really bright lights in the module, and then they had like warning buzzers going off all the time, and just like the general adrenaline of being there. And how they eventually solved it is sleeping pills.
right.
And so they figured the right, the right sleeping pill, and that's like knocks the astronauts out. So also they figured out how to like make hammocks, like lightweight, like comfortable
Yeah.
ways for an astronaut. Like Neil and Buzz didn't have that. Like they didn't have hammocks, they didn't have beds to sleep in. They just like Buzz just laid on the floor. So yeah, like sleeping on the moon is like, yeah, as a whole
That's
area of
that's the next
interest.
project.
Yeah.
Just going back through the transcripts, I'm just picking out the different kind of characters that exist. It's not just Neil and Buzz. We've got the
Sure.
the Capcom
Yep.
capsule communicator. We've got
Mhm.
Collins, and we've got the President Nixon.
Yeah.
Were there any other people involved that you actually didn't include, but were actually captured on the transcript?
So Capcom, the astronauts who serve as Capcom, and these are famous people. So NASA only astronauts talk to astronauts. So Capcom is like these guys were famous, and early on it's like, well, I'm actually going to name them, and that actually, like, because there was a couple different ones, that actually kind of detracts from like it makes it confusing. And like everybody already has kind of like a popular conception of like talking to Houston, so like we just kind of like roll with that.
Yeah.
It also kind of distracts from Neil and Buzz. But yeah, there's this center channel which is white, which is Capcom. So yeah, you make Capcom white because yes, you are showing it. It's not grayed out like everything you're not showing, but like it's not special, right? It's just like this neutral. It's this neutral color that shows up when it's there and disappears otherwise. And I label it in the center channel. And then Michael Collins also, who's orbiting up above, he's in gold, and that kind of works with the patriotic color situation,
Yeah.
and also like the gold foil associated with the mission itself. But he's only there when he's in the story, and then he disappears.
And I love how he comes sort of flying on and he kind of flies past. I really like that little flourish.
Yeah.
The interactivity, screening a little bit deeper into the design choices. Obviously, there's the scrollability. I actually missed, until about an hour before our conversation, the hover over the images to see the original photographs, and it just feels like a nice little Easter egg that kind of. I mean, I noticed that you do signpost it, but I completely missed that. But so that's another element of detail that I think is fantastic about it. Even though I like the consistency of the illustrations as the default view, but then there's more should you wish to see there.
Yeah.
Were there any other interactive features you were tempted to include?
I think that there's an idea, whether I was tempted or not, but to make the timeline progress interactive. And so you could imagine it being interactive in a couple ways. One, you could hover over any dot and read the transcript that way. Another is to actually navigate the story by that timeline. So, you could kind of like click or whatever. And so there's several reasons why not to do that. Although, beyond just like, that's just another thing that you have to make. One is like, this is a story. I actually want, like, I'm the storyteller and I'm going to take you through it at my pace. And this is not a transcript explorer. That's very intentional. And I think I say that in the, like, if you want to go read the transcript, go read the transcript. It's going to take you a couple hours. And it's going to be, frankly, like, kind of boring. Like, I've already done that work. And the whole intention of the piece is to provide you a sense of what happened, and get you everything you need to know. And, you can read this in like less than 10 minutes. Right. And so like I'm not trying to make something to satisfy all needs, like very specifically, but that's something that, some people asked for early on, and something I considered, but, ultimately rejected.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think it's, again, that idea of the data adventure that you talked about before. But I do think there is often temptation to give people tools that they don't need, to give them a chance to click on things, to choose things, when, as you say, you are the custodian of the story. You sit back, listener or viewer, and I'm going to tell you a story. I think that works very well with this. We've spoken already about the colours, the kind of metaphorical space black, the moon grey, the red and blue, which, as you mentioned before, the flag colours stands out there.
Yes, I mean, so that's something also historic about the colors. So not on this mission, but in following Apollo missions, like one of the problems with this mission is like the astronauts look the same. So if you look at the media, it's like, well, wait, who's who? And so what they did in following Apollo missions is they distinguished the two astronauts, and what they gave is the commander, they gave him big red stripes on his suit, so that like it was very obvious who is who. And so the commander gets red because of the red stripes, and then Buzz gets the complimentary and patriotic blue. So it's sort of, I mean, it's not something that they had, on this mission, but it's something definitely in the Apollo kind of like design scheme. So that's why the astronauts are colored that way.
Right, that makes lots of sense. Yeah, great.
And then these particular shades, they're, I mean, it's not like true red and true blue, right? So these are like very carefully, sort of like, they're darker shades meant to work with this like space black kind of aesthetic. And I think I referenced a lot of like mid-century modern kind of like bicentennial era sort of like American graphic design, trying to pick out the right combination of red, blue, and gold.
It feels less harsh on the eye against the black and the white, of course.
Yeah.
With regards to annotations, so obviously as a device where you are sort of saying things, I mean, the transcripts, speak for themselves. The title, how long did it take you to arrive at that title? Kind of obvious from the start.
I don't exactly remember. Actually, let's check the archive. But yeah, Neil and Buzz go for a walk. So I was thinking of that as in terms of a almost like a children's book, right? Because the whole idea behind this is to make it very human. But an early title was Seeing Tranquility. And then with a subtitle, Looking Back at Apollo 11 with a Human Perspective. So, I mean, that's sort of, I mean, that's maybe a little bit, that's less cute and more, maybe a little bit more poetic, maybe a little bit more, I don't know. But the subtitle, Looking Back at Apollo 11 with a Human Perspective, that sort of conveys what I was trying to do. And so that draft title existed, let's see the file, the date, June 22nd. So that name existed about a month before I published.
I mean, I think they both completely work. And I think it's just the idea that, this is the most normal thing in the world to do, go for a walk, but it's the most non-normal thing to do as well at the same time.
Yeah.
The intro sets out the prospect. It establishes the color palette. It establishes the interactive instruction, so that it does a lot of work in a very sort of lean way, which I think's kind of important, really. People just want to get on with things; they don't want to read instructions. So I think that's a really well judged sort of lean asset. And then you talked about trust, which is is clearly paramount for any work, and I think the importance therefore that you've shared the data provenance, and you've then linked as well to the sort of design essay to give people a sense of your reasoning, your rationale for why you've done this. And again, I think that's something that we can easily neglect to include, but when it's done and it's done well, like you've done there, I think it just makes it even more substantive as a piece of work. But just sort of closing off the discussion with your kind of reflections, then. Suppose that this would have been a print project. How would have that have worked out? What would that have looked like, do you think?
Oh, I mean, I know exactly what it would have looked like because I mocked it up. Yeah, so there's two versions of this in print. So one would be as kind of like a full page spread in a magazine. And so in that version, like you don't have the interactivity, and so you have to figure out how to show all these astronauts moving around. And so you end up doing sort of like arrows showing their motion. And even in a full page spread, like you don't have the real estate to present as much of the transcript as I have here, and certainly not all the commentary about like exactly what's going on, because you can understand a lot from the transcript, but I also have this running sort of dark gray annotation explaining what was going on if it wasn't obvious, just from reading their text. And so you lose a lot of that. But you can still have the red and blue text. You can still show kind of like where they were at important moments. So that's like the static magazine spread. And then at the same time, I mocked up a poster version. And so the poster version, which, after having the discussion, I think I should revive, but the poster version, which, I'll share, with you some of kind of like the mock-ups for this. But the way I handled the static there is you can imagine a horizontal poster, okay, and at the baseline of the poster is the introductory text, and then above that is just the illustration. So no timeline, just the illustration, and then above that, and the illustration is filled with astronauts, like all of them. And then above that is 1, 2, 3. There's 7 columns, and each of the 7 columns are 7 important exchanges at different timestamps. And so these exchanges are just sort of like 7 different vignettes. And then above those 7 different vignettes is a circle mask detail of the illustration of just that particular moment. And so doing it this way, you sort of get a sense of the overall scale. You get just in the same way that you get the image within the text chat, you get a detailed view of what's going on, during this important moment. And so that's how it's going to work for the poster.
And of course, that requires even greater editorial decision making about what to leave out. But I mean, you just touched on it there. I forgot to mention it before. I really like also the sort of ghosting effect you create, the sort of residual where the two guys have been, so you can sort of see the faded backstory, so you can get a sense of the footprint that they've made, which is fantastic.
Yeah. So for anybody listening, we have this single view on the moon's surface, and the astronauts move around it. But as they move forward through the story, they leave a ghost trail, which is just a semi-transparent view of where they used to be. And that was a later addition. And so this was published in late July, with the 50th anniversary. And then several months later, I went to a conference called NACIS, North American Cartographic Information Society, which is a fantastic experience. And I forget exactly what triggered, but while at NACIS, I had the idea that, I need to go back to this piece and add these ghost trails. And so the piece was not published with the ghost trails. And what that ends up doing is it creates a visually sort of empty experience. and it's exciting to see the ghost trails, because you have this sense of progress, almost like a cartoon, where you can see kind of like, kind of where you've been.
Yeah, and it feels like some of those pieces you often see. I'm thinking again, the New York Times is the obvious place, but they do coverage of like the Winter Olympics. And you might see some figure skater, and there's a
Yes.
sense of a single view of their kind of all kind of the motion of their action.
Yeah,
Which I
there's
think
like
is a
a
terrific technique.
photo viz
Yeah,
aspect.
absolutely right. Yeah, that's fantastic. Just last couple of points, then. So people will always ask about the technology. Can you just give a quick run through the stack that you went through for this process?
Oh, yeah, quite a lot. I mean, so let's see. Google Sheets, Excel, Adobe Illustrator, Google Earth, Tableau, Scrollama. Trying to think what else I use. Oh, Procreate. So all the illustrations done in.
Right.
Well, actually, no. I mean, first pencil and paper. So
Yeah.
rough sketches and pencil and paper. Procreate. I'm trying to think what else I'm using. Did I Photoshop? Yeah, I use Photoshop a lot. And so all the illustrations are done in grayscale. So they're done in, I think, 5 shades of gray, 4 or 5 shades of gray. And then they're all done with like that in order to focus my eye on actually like working on the shading. Cause again, I'm kind of learning how to do this as I do it. And then in Photoshop, I'm actually turning them blue and red.
Right.
So let's think. So that's a lot. You have like the Google suite of tools, right? And then you have the creative suite of tools, and then you have front end web development. And so I'm trying to think, I probably use I think VS Code, and then this whole thing is hosted on GitHub Pages.
Right.
And so it's not actually, I mean, I have a website that's that I manage through WordPress, but actually these interactive pieces, I use GitHub Pages, and it looks like they're on the WordPress site, but they're really not. Yeah.
So
I don't know. Is that enough?
There's a lot going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's the problem. Our first point was about a data adventure, right? And like the problem is that you're trying to do something new, and that means that you're doing something that these tools aren't necessarily created for. And that's fun, but it also means that like, you're using like 15 tools to make the story.
Yeah, and it comes back to the point you mentioned about the craft. This is craft, and craft usually involves lots of different tools, and it's about a means to an end often, rather than it just being some single slick tool that does everything. Because I think that therefore relinquishes a certain degree of control that you therefore have. Just to close off then, RJ, we talked about how this was as much as anything a journey for yourself about learning new skills, experiences, tools, whatever it may be. As you reflect on this, what are some of the headline thoughts that you have about the experience? What are some of your favorite bits or elements of it that you kind of look back and think, yeah, I nailed that?
So I think that what's interesting about these passion project pieces is they hardly ever get attention when they're published. At least not attention that sort of makes the effort worth it. But as you look back on it now, over a year later, and we're talking about it, it's quite lovely, like having it, and having people enjoy it, and being able to talk about it. So that part's nice. But when I think about this piece, like, it was born at a time when I had a lot of frustration happening professionally, and so I don't necessarily associate this piece with a lot of joy because of that. But when I so when I think of the piece and it's not in front of me, like, it's not always like the happiest thoughts. But when I go to the piece and I experience it, I love it. I really love it because I love the aesthetic of it. And it's just like a very reassuring kind of like it's its own thing. And I really believe it's a complete, like, the way that the text and the illustration and the colors and the way they all interact, it's like one of the better compositions I think I've ever done. And I really love that about this piece. And whenever I have an opportunity to revisit it and actually look at it, that always makes me really happy.
Yeah, no, I mean that's wonderful, and I think it's deserved because I remember when this first came out. I think I'm sure I included it in one of my best of lists and really enjoyed it. And I was delighted when we picked this as the topic for the conversation. I actually even more appreciated it when I went through the process of preparing for this conversation and saw the little details and saw the thought process in the article and saw the decisions that you'd made that I was thinking, what would I have done? Yes, I would have done that as well. And I think it's not that it's a grower in that it starts at a low base. It's a great piece that actually gets better. It's like a good wine. The more time you spend with it and think about it. So no, I think you've got every reason to look back fondly about it, and and all the other benefits that come from the process that you've gone through as well. So I mean that's terrific. Thank you ever so much, sir, for going through that conversation, that backstory. That's the end of today's episode. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in to listen, to watch, and we'll see you again on the next episode of Explore, Explain.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.